Hello, good morning, everybody. How are you today? We are back for another Bible story reading. For those of you joining one of these videos for the first time, let me tell you what we do here. We are going through the different Bible stories and we are reading them completely. This is for people who don't know what the Bible stories are, who have only heard bits and pieces, or maybe you have forgotten what the stories are. Whatever the reason, this is an opportunity for you to learn what the stories of the Bible are. Not the Hollywood version, not the meme versions, not what little part of it somebody has told you, but the entire stories. We've been going through 1 Samuel, and as you remember, yesterday was one of my favorite stories. We talked about David and Goliath. And we told that entire story of how David ended up even approaching Goliath and finding out about him, and how he ended up killing this giant with nothing but a slingshot and a stone. And now we are in 1 Samuel chapter 18. And to catch you up, Saul is king at this time. But God is not with Saul anymore because Saul just kept disobeying God too many times. And so he removed the kingship from Saul. Although Saul is still the reigning king, he may still be in the palace, he may still be on the throne. He is not the king that will be seated for long because God intends to put David in that spot. Neither David nor Saul realized this at this point of the story. But we're going to go ahead and start reading in chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. When David had finished speaking with Saul, sorry about that, my phone is ringing. Let's start over. When David had finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan was bound to David in close friendship and loved him as much as he loved himself. Saul kept David with him from that day on and did not let him return to his father's house. Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as much as himself. Then Jonathan removed the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his military tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. David marched out with the army and was successful in everything Saul sent him to do. Saul put him in command of the fighting men, which pleased all the people, and Saul's servants as well. As the troops were coming back, when David was returning from killing the Philistines, the women came out from all the cities of Israel to meet King Saul, singing and dancing with tambourines, with shouts of joy, and with three-stringed instruments. As they danced, the women sang, "Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands." Saul was furious and resented this song. "They credited tens of thousands to David," he complained, "but they only credited me with thousands. What more could he have but the kingdom?" So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward. The next day, an evil spirit sent from God came powerfully on Saul, and he began to rave inside the palace. David was playing the lyre as usual, but Saul was holding a spear and he threw it, thinking, "I'll pin David to the wall." But David got away from him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David, but had left Saul. Therefore, Saul sent David away from him and made him commander over 1,000 men. David led the troops and continued to be successful in his activities because the Lord was with him. When Saul observed that David was very successful, he dreaded him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he was leading their troops. Saul told David, "Here is my oldest daughter, Merab. I'll give her to you as a wife, if you will be a warrior for me and fight the Lord's battles." But Saul was thinking, "I need to raise a hand against him. I don't need to raise a hand against him. Let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Then David responded, "Who am I, and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law?" When it was time to give Saul's daughter Merab to David, she was given to Adriel the Mahalathite as a wife. Now Saul's daughter Michal loved David, and when it was reported to Saul, it pleased him. I'll give her to him, Saul thought. She'll be a trap for him, and the hand of the Philistines will be against him. So Saul said to David a second time, You can now be my son-in-law. Saul then ordered his servants, Speak to David in private and tell him, Look, the king is pleased with you, and all his servants love you. Therefore, you should become the king's son-in-law. Saul's servants reported these words directly to David, but he replied, Is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law? I'm a poor commoner. The servants reported back to Saul, These are the words David spoke. Then Saul replied, Say this to David, The king desires no other bride price except 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies. Actually, Saul intended to cause David's death at the hand of the Philistines. When the servants reported these terms to David, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. Before the wedding day arrived, David and his men went out and killed 200 Philistines. He brought their foreskins and presented them as full payment to the king to become his son-in-law. Then Saul gave his daughter Michal to David as his wife. Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved him, and he became even more afraid of David. As a result, Saul was David's enemy from then on. Every time the Philistine commanders came out to fight, David was more successful than all of Saul's officers. So his name became well known. That was chapter 18 of 1 Samuel. Remember, there are 3 ways that we study and look at these stories when we read them. What does it say? We have to have reading comprehension. What was it saying to the people of the time? We have to understand the culture and the context and history. And what, if anything, is it saying to us today? So this is really a fun story. We notice that Saul has become very jealous of David for many reasons. First off, his own son, Jonathan, loves David like a brother. Jonathan makes a covenant with David that they're going to be like brothers, brothers from another mother kind of thing. And he gives him his tunic, his sword, his coat, and he basically places David above him. And this is Saul's very own son. Then the women come out to play and sing in front of Saul, and the song that they sing says, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. And Saul is extremely jealous of all of the fame and attention that David is getting. He wants to be the most popular, but instead, David has become popular, and he's extremely jealous, so he starts to plot and plan ways to kill David. If you remember in the previous chapter, whenever Saul would be tormented by this spirit, this evil spirit, David would come and play the lyre for him, and it would calm him down. Well, Saul goes on this rampage, and he's being tormented. God actually sent this spirit, and that may seem a little bit strange that God sent this spirit to torment him, but if you remember, if we go as far back as Exodus, and we look at what happened during the time that Moses was telling Pharaoh to let the people go from Israel, God actually hardened Pharaoh's hearts. He will allow certain people to do certain things and to have certain bad things happen to them when they refuse to cooperate with God's plan. And Saul had refused to cooperate with God's plan. So God is allowing these things to happen to Saul as a way of using Saul's behavior to bring about his will. Okay? So now Saul has gone on this rampage. David tries playing a lyre for him, but Saul thinks to himself, I'm just going to kill him. And he takes his spear and he throws it at David. Twice he does this. And David gets out of the way, and Saul is not successful. So now he's even more afraid. He's more upset. He understands God is with this kid. So he thinks to himself, I know what I'll do. I will, since the people like him and everything, I will give him my daughter to marry. And I'll give him my oldest daughter. because that's the one that they would give away in marriage first. They went in order. And so that would make him my son-in-law. But I'm actually doing this to trap him, to get him all set up so that, the Philistines will end up killing him, and it'll be a trap. But he's like, I'm a nobody. I don't have a way to pay for this daughter, because that's what they did. They gave dowries. They paid a price for these brides, and he said, I can't do that. So Saul gave her to somebody else. But then he found out that his other daughter, Michal, was in love with David. And he thinks to himself, this is even better. I'll use her as a trap. So he offers to let David marry. And he says, I'm a nobody. And he tells Saul's servants, he says, I'm a nobody. How am I supposed to be able to take her as my bride? So Saul must have recognized the pride of David, that David wanted to be able to pay a dowry, pay for his bride like everybody else. And he says, well, here's the price that I'm going to set. Bring me 100 foreskin. Sounds disgusting, doesn't it? Bring me 100 foreskin of the Philistine army. And David thinks, okay, that's a fair price. So he goes out and he ends up bringing 200. He doubles it. He brings twice as many. He kills these Philistines or whatever, and he brings their foreskin and to Saul. And then he becomes the husband of Michal. And now Saul has just decided that David is now his enemy forever and ever. He can't stand David at all. Because every time he sends David out to battle, he is more successful than Saul's own men. He's more successful than the time before. He just keeps showing him up, and he's not getting killed by the hand of the Philistines. So Saul is very upset about this and jealous. He's deeply and greatly jealous. What, if anything, do we get out of this particular chapter? I think that there's a lot that we can read into this in terms of, what does it say to you specifically? Is there something in your life that you can relate this to? Is there something going on in our culture today that we could relate this to? Are there jealous people in the world who want power and position but are being stripped of it by other people that God has planned? What things can we take away from this? The one thing that we need to understand is God will always have his way. Always. God was with David because David chose to cooperate with God and do things the way God wanted them done. Saul, on the other hand, did not want to cooperate with God, did not want to do things God's way. So things got pretty crazy for Saul's life. He's tormented by evil spirits. He's an angry person. He's a jealous person. He's a bitter person. He keeps getting shown up. He keeps getting one-upped by David. And David's not even trying to one-up him. He's just going about living his life for God, and the blessings of God keep getting poured out on David because God saw David's heart. Well, that's where we're going to leave off today. I look forward to continuing this story sometime in the next few days. We are going to switch gears. We're going to take a break from 1 Samuel, and we're going to read the story of the prodigal son. No doubt that's something that you have probably heard before about the prodigal son, but we're going to read that story in its entirety. In the meantime, I hope you learned something today, and I look forward to being back here to do another reading with you. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.